The last thing Elijah Mensah Owusu saw before he closed his eyes on the overnight bus from Kumasi was the road stretching ahead in the headlights, red earth and darkness, and the occasional flash of a roadside fire where someone was selling something to no one in particular at this hour. If this story is already speaking to something inside you, take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel and drop a like. We are on our way to 5,000 subscribers, and every single one of you is part of this family. Now let us continue. He was 38 years old, and he was going home for the first time in 6 years, and home was a place called Odumasaman, a small town outside Accra, where the streets had no names that anyone used, and where everyone knew which house you meant when you said the one with the big avocado tree at the gate, or the one where old Madame Fossua used to sell kontomaya stew on Thursdays. He had a single bag in the overhead rack. It was not a large bag. 6 years abroad, first in Ivory Coast, then in Senegal working in construction supervision, then 2 years in a small Ghanaian contracting firm in Dakar that had eventually folded under the weight of its own mismanagement. And this was what he was returning with. One bag, a body that had learned to work hard, and a heart that had been carrying the particular weight of a son who left his mother behind and has been sending money home every month, hoping that money is the same thing as presents, knowing all along that it is not. His mother's name was Agnes Mensah Owusu. She was 74 years old. She had raised Elijah and his older brother Cornelius in a house on the edge of Odumasaman, on a piece of land that her own mother had left her. A plot of land that was not large but was, as Agnes had told both her sons more times than either could count, not about the size but about what it means to have a piece of this earth that belongs to you and cannot be taken away. Cannot be taken away. Elijah shifted in his seat and looked out the window at the darkness passing and thought about his mother's hands. She had the hands of a woman who had worked all her life, not roughly, not carelessly, but with the steady, deliberate application of someone who understood that things worth having required tending. She had been a seamstress for 40 years, working from the front room of the house on a Singer machine that was older than Cornelius, accepting fabric and measurements and returning, always on time, always precise, garments that made people look better than they had imagined they could look. She had paid school fees with those hands. She had cooked and cleaned and prayed and endured with those hands. And when Elijah's father Solomon had died of a stroke in 2009, it was those hands that had held the family together while everything else threatened to come apart. The bus hit a pothole and several passengers swayed, and someone in the front complained loudly, and the driver said something dismissive, and the bus continued. Elijah looked at his phone. 1 bar of signal. Barely. He had tried to call his mother 3 times in the past 2 weeks. The first time the call had gone through, but Agnes had sounded strange, distracted, or tired, or something else that Elijah could not name, but had filed in that internal drawer where sons keep the things about their mothers that worry them. The second and third times the call had not connected. He had sent a message through his cousin Patience, who lived closer to Odumasaman, asking her to check on Agnes. Patience had replied with the particular vagueness of someone who knows something they have been asked not to say. "She is fine. She is resting. She says she is looking forward to seeing you." The kind of message that answers nothing while appearing to answer everything. He had bought his bus ticket the next morning. Cornelius Mensah Owusu was 43 years old and lived in a gated estate in East Legon, which was a 45-minute drive from Odumasaman on a good day and a different world on any day. He had done well. This was the word the family used for what Cornelius had become, done well, which covered a great deal of territory without requiring specifics. He had a car that was new every 3 years. He had a wife named Vivian who wore her hair straightened and her opinions unfiltered. He had 2 children in a private school whose fees Elijah knew about only because Agnes had mentioned them once with a particular careful pride that mothers have about grandchildren regardless of which son provided them. What Agnes had never mentioned, and what Elijah had gradually pieced together from the silences in her phone calls over the past year, was that Cornelius had been coming to Odumasaman more frequently than usual. Not for visits. Cornelius did not do visits, not in the way of a son who comes to sit with his mother and eat her food and ask about her health. He came in his new car, with his leather portfolio and his phone calls that he took outside in the compound. walking in circles the way men walk when they are discussing things they do not want overheard. Agnes had mentioned these visits in the way she mentioned things she was uncertain about, briefly, in the middle of other sentences, as though hoping the information would be received without requiring a response. The bus pulled into the Accra station as the sky was beginning to lighten, that first uncertain grey that precedes the actual dawn. Elijah retrieved his bag from the overhead rack and stepped off into the noise and the smell and the organized chaos of an Accra motor park at 5:30 in the morning, diesel and fried food and humanity in motion, the particular energy of a city that never fully sleeps but naps in shifts. He found a trotro heading toward Odumaseman and sat by the window and watched Accra give way to its outskirts, and the outskirts give way to the smaller roads, and the smaller roads give way to the red earth tracks that he had walked every day of his childhood without noticing them, the way you do not notice the air you breathe until you have been somewhere the air is different. The avocado tree at the gate of his mother's house was bigger than he remembered. He stood outside the gate for a moment with his bag at his feet and looked at it, the tree his grandfather had planted before Agnes was born, its roots lifting the edge of the compound wall in 2 places, its branches heavy and dark green in the early morning light. He pushed the gate open. The compound was quiet. The main house sat at the back of the plot, a modest structure of 4 rooms with a veranda that ran along the front. The walls painted a pale yellow that had faded over the years to something closer to the color of old paper. On the veranda, Agnes's chair, the plastic armchair she had been given by the women's group at church and which had become, over 10 years, as specifically hers as her own name, sat empty. The kitchen door was open. Elijah crossed the compound. He smelled the kitchen before he reached it, charcoal and the faint sweetness of ripe plantain, and something else beneath that, something that was simply the smell of his mother's kitchen, a smell that does not translate into any specific ingredient because it is made of years and not of food. Agnes was standing at the stove with her back to him, stirring something in a clay pot with the long wooden spoon she had used since before he was born. She was smaller than he remembered, or perhaps he had simply forgotten, the way you forget the true scale of things when you carry only the memory of them. Her hair was wrapped in a pale blue cloth. Her house dress hung loose on shoulders that had become narrower with age. He stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her stir, and felt something move through him that had no name, but lived somewhere between love and grief, and gratitude and shame. "Mama," he said. Agnes turned, and the wooden spoon clattered against the side of the clay pot, and her hand went to her mouth, and her eyes, which had been the eyes of a woman absorbed in her morning task, became something else entirely, became the eyes of a mother receiving the thing she has been asking God for in the quiet of every morning prayer for 6 years. "Elijah," she said. It was barely a whisper. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, and she met him in the middle, and he bent to hold her because she had always been shorter than him, and she held him back with those hands, those seamstress hands that had held everything together, and pressed her face against his chest, and he felt her breathing, fast at first, then slowing, as though his presence was itself a medicine that was already working. They stood like that for a long time. The clay pot bubbled gently on the stove. Outside, the morning continued its patient arrival over Odumaseman. When Agnes finally stepped back, she kept both her hands on his arms and looked at his face the way mothers look at returned children, searching, reading, verifying, comparing what stands before them with the version they have been maintaining in memory. She touched his cheek. She touched his forehead. She said in Twi, something that translated roughly as "You are thin, but your eyes are still good," and he understood that she was not just talking about his weight. She made him sit. She brought him water first, then the food she had been preparing, not because she had known he was coming this morning specifically, she told him, but because she had dreamed of him 2 nights running and had decided that the dreams were instruction rather than imagination, and had begun cooking accordingly. Are you watching this story from Accra, London, New York, or somewhere else in this wide world? Drop your country in the comments right now and hit that like button. Your support means everything to this channel. He ate. She sat across from him at the small kitchen table and watched him eat with her hands folded and her face holding the particular piece of a woman whose most important prayer has just been answered. and Elijah ate his mother's food and felt for the first time in 6 years that he was in the right place. He did not yet know what that place was about to cost him to keep. Agnes would not let him sleep until she had fed him properly. The bowl of contomire stew she placed before him was the kind that took the better part of a morning to prepare. The kind where the vegetables had been washed 3 times and the smoked fish had been deboned with the patience of someone who understood that a bone in the throat was not a small thing, and the palm oil had been measured not with a spoon, but with the eye of a woman who had been measuring palm oil for 50 years and whose eye was more accurate than any spoon. Elijah ate slowly, deliberately, the way you eat when you understand that the food in front of you is not simply food, but is a communication, a declaration, an act of love made edible. Agnes sat across from him and said very little. She asked about the journey. She asked whether the bus had been comfortable. She asked whether he had eaten anything on the road, and when he said a small something, she made the sound that Ghanaian mothers make when the answer to that question is unsatisfactory, a sound that is not quite disapproval and not quite worry, but is the precise combination of both. Outside the kitchen window, Odumasaman was conducting its morning business. Children in school uniforms moving along the red earth path in small clusters, a woman passing with a basin of tomatoes on her head, the sound of a radio from the compound next door playing a gospel song that drifted through the window and mixed with the smell of the food in a way that felt, to Elijah, like the physical sensation of being home. He finished eating. He pushed the bowl back and looked at his mother across the table and said, "Mama, tell me everything is fine." Agnes looked at her hands on the table. It was a brief look, barely a second, but Elijah had grown up reading his mother's silences the way other people read books, and that single downward glance told him more than a paragraph of speech would have. "Everything is fine," she said. "Mama, you just arrived. Rest first. We will talk." "We will talk now," he said. Not harshly. He had never spoken to his mother harshly in his life and did not intend to begin, but with the gentle firmness of a son who has traveled through the night on a concern and is not prepared to be redirected by love, however genuine that love is. Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she rose and went to the stove and adjusted the flame beneath a pot that did not need adjusting, which was the thing she did when she was preparing to say something difficult. She stood with her back to him and spoke to the wall above the stove. "Cornelius has been coming," she said. "I know," Elijah said. "He brought a man with him, a man with papers." "What kind of papers?" Agnes turned from the stove. In the morning light coming through the kitchen window, Elijah could see his mother's face with a clarity that 6 years of phone calls had denied him, and what he saw there was not simply age he had expected, but a particular kind of tiredness that had nothing to do with sleep. It was the tiredness of a woman who has been carrying a worry she does not fully understand, and has been carrying it alone. "He said they were for my security," Agnes said. "He said that at my age, having the land sitting there undocumented was a risk. He said the government had a new program for registering family land, and that if I did not register it properly, it could be claimed." She paused. She pressed her lips together. "He said he would handle everything, that I just needed to sign to give him the authority to process it on my behalf." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the gospel song from the neighbor's radio had ended and been replaced by a talking drum sequence that moved through the morning air with the particular urgency of something being announced. Elijah set both his hands flat on the table. He looked at them. He kept his voice even. "Did you sign, Mama?" Agnes looked at her son for a long moment. In her eyes was something that Elijah recognized as the expression of a woman who has realized, in retrospect, that the ground she was walking on was not as solid as she had believed, and who is now accounting for every step she took across it. "He is my son," she said quietly. "He told me it was for my protection." "Mama, did you sign?" "I signed 2 papers," she said. 3 weeks ago. He said they were for the land registration. He said the office required 2 forms." Elijah closed his eyes. He kept them closed for 4 seconds. He opened them. He kept his face still and his voice level because his mother was looking at him with an expression that was already moving towards self-blame, and the last thing she needed, the absolute last thing, was for her returned son to confirm her fear that she had done something that could not be undone. "It is all right," he said. "We will find out what they were. Don't worry." "Elijah, Mama, I promise you, we will find out." He stood from the table and went to her and took her hands and held them and looked at her directly the way his father Solomon had always looked at people when he wanted them to receive what he was saying, not just in their minds, but in their bones. Agnes looked back at him and searched his face and found in it what she needed to find. Not false comfort, but genuine steadiness, which is a different thing entirely and which cannot be performed convincingly by someone who does not actually possess it. She squeezed his hands. Then she said, "There is something else." She went to the bedroom. He heard the wardrobe opening, the sound of things being moved. She returned with a folded piece of paper, a printout of some kind, creased along the middle as though it had been folded and unfolded several times. She handed it to him. He unfolded it. It was an email, printed from someone's phone by the look of the formatting, and it had been sent 3 months ago from an address that contained the name of a property development company he did not recognize to an address that was clearly Cornelius's. The subject line said, "Re-Odumasaman plot, confirmed valuation and offer letter." He read it. He read it twice. Then he folded it along the same creases his mother had made and held it in his hand and stood in the kitchen of his mother's house and understood, fully and without any remaining ambiguity, what his brother had been doing with his visits and his papers and his talk of government programs and his use of the word security. The land, Agnes's land, the land her own mother had left her. The land that Elijah had grown up playing on and that contained the avocado tree his grandfather had planted and the corner where his father Solomon had kept a small garden of pepper and garden eggs and which was, in every sense that mattered, the physical embodiment of this family's right to exist in this place, had been valued by a Lagos-based property developer at a figure that was significant. Not enormous in the way of city land, but significant in the way of a sum that could reorder a life, or end an argument, or make a man in East Legon feel that he had finally settled something with the world. And Cornelius had been in correspondence with them for at least 3 months. "Where did you get this?" Elijah asked. Agnes sat back down at the table. She folded her hands. "Patience found it," she said. "Your cousin. She came to visit last month, and Cornelius had been here the day before, and she found it on the floor beside my chair. She thinks he dropped it without knowing." Elijah thought of Patience's careful, vague message. "She is fine. She is resting. She says she is looking forward to seeing you." He understood now the weight that message had been carrying. He sat back down across from his mother. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The morning had fully arrived now, the sun coming properly through the kitchen window, laying a rectangle of gold across the worn table between them. And in that light, Agnes's face was very clear and very present, and very much the face of a woman who deserved better than this, which is the kind of thought that does not help anyone, but which arrives anyway. "He is coming on Saturday," Agnes said. "He called yesterday. He said he has the final papers. He said I only need to sign one more thing, and everything will be processed." Saturday was 4 days away. Elijah looked at the email in his hand. He looked at his mother's hands on the table. He thought of Solomon, his father, who had worked as a clerk in the Lands Commission for 22 years and who had understood, as few people did, the specific vulnerability of family land that passed through women, the way it was targeted, the way it was made to seem complicated so that the person it belonged to would feel grateful for someone else to manage it. He thought of what his father would say if he were here. Then he thought of what his father would do, which was a more useful thought. If you are watching this story and you have a mother, a grandmother, an auntie who is older and alone and trusts too easily, share this video with someone who needs to hear it right now. And subscribe to this channel so stories like this one keep reaching the people who need them. Are you watching from Kumasi, Nairobi, Birmingham, or Atlanta? Tell us where you are in the comments. Elijah folded the email and put it in his shirt pocket. He stood. He looked at his mother. "Mama," he said, "do you remember Papa's friend, Mr. Achampong? The one who used to come for funerals and always brought a bottle of schnapps and argued with Papa about football until midnight?" Agnes almost smiled. "Kwame Achampong, he moved to Tama. Is he still practicing law?" Agnes looked at her son for a moment. Then she stood slowly from the table, went to the shelf above the refrigerator, reached behind the small radio that had not worked since 2021, and produced a piece of paper with a phone number written in ballpoint pen in a careful, deliberate hand. She held it out to him. Elijah looked at it. He looked at her. "Your father wrote that number there," Agnes said quietly, 2 months before he died. "He put it there, and he said to me, 'If the time comes when you need a lawyer and you cannot trust anyone in this house to find you one, this number is still good. I have been looking at it for 15 years. She pressed the paper into his hand. "I think the time has come," she said. Kwame Acheampong's office in Tema was on the second floor of a building that had been painted white once and was now the color of a decision that had been postponed too many times. The staircase was narrow, and the railing moved when you held it, not dangerously but enough to remind you that it was there on a provisional basis. On the wall going up the stairs were 3 framed certificates and a photograph of a younger Kwame Acheampong shaking hands with a man in a kente cloth who had the look of someone officially important. And beside that photograph, slightly crooked, a handwritten sign that said, in English and then in Twi, "Justice is not what the powerful say it is. It is what the truth requires." Elijah read the sign on his way up and felt something settle in his chest, the way a compass settles when it finds north. He had called ahead from his mother's kitchen using the number Solomon had written behind the radio, half expecting the number to be dead. 15 years was a long time for a phone number to remain faithful. But it had rung twice and been answered by a voice that was old and precise, and when Elijah said his name and said he was Solomon Mensah Owusu's son, had gone quiet for a moment before saying simply, "Come today if you can." Kwame Acheampong was 70 years old and looked like a man who had decided somewhere around 50 that he was no longer going to perform youth for anyone's comfort. He was thin and dark, with close-cropped white hair and reading glasses that he wore pushed up on his forehead except when he was actually reading, at which point he brought them down with the precision of a man deploying a tool. His desk was covered in papers, but not in chaos. There was a system to it that only he understood, which is the kind of system that works perfectly until the person who created it is no longer there. But that was not today's problem. He stood when Elijah entered and came around the desk and shook his hand with both hands, and then held him at arm's length and looked at his face for a moment with the eyes of a man reading a document he has been expecting. "You have Solomon's forehead," he said, "and Agnes's jaw. That is a strong combination." He gestured to the chair across the desk. They sat. Elijah put the printed email on the desk. He put beside it the description Agnes had given him of the 2 documents she had signed. Not the documents themselves, which Cornelius had taken with him, but Agnes's account of what she remembered of them, which Elijah had written down in his phone on the trotro to Tema, asking her to remember every detail, the color of the paper, the size of the print, whether there was a stamp, whether Cornelius had let her read them fully, or had pointed to the signature line and held the pen toward her. Kwame Acheampong read the email. He read Elijah's notes on his phone, which Elijah handed to him. He read without interrupting and without reacting, the face of a man who has learned that reacting during the reading phase costs you information you need. When he finished, he set the phone down and the email beside it, and removed his reading glasses and placed them on the desk, and looked at Elijah. "Your brother is not a stupid man," he said. It was not a compliment. It was a diagnosis. "Tell me what you know about property transfer law in this region," he continued, "and I will tell you what I know about what your brother has been doing." "I know very little," Elijah said honestly. "Good," Kwame said. "Honest ignorance is easier to fill than dishonest knowledge." He leaned back in his chair and spoke in the measured, unhurried way of a man who has explained important things to frightened people for 40 years and has learned that clarity is the first form of help. "The land in Odumazaman," he explained, was registered as family land under Agnes's name following the death of her own mother in 1994. Family land under Ghanaian customary law had specific rules of inheritance and transfer. It could not be sold by one family member alone without the consent of the other recognized family members, in this case, Agnes's children. However, and here Kwame paused and pressed 2 fingers together in the gesture of a man about to identify the precise location of a wound. A power of attorney, properly executed, could authorize one person to act on behalf of the landowner in all property matters, including signing transfer documents. If your mother signed a power of attorney, Kwame said, and if that document was properly witnessed and notarized, then Cornelius has the legal authority to complete a sale on her behalf, without her needing to sign anything further. She said the papers were for land registration, Elijah said. She said he told her it was a government program. Kwame looked at him steadily. Did she read the documents? She said the print was small and Cornelius explained them to her. She said he told her where to sign. Was anyone else present? Only Cornelius and the man he brought with him, a man with a folder. And this man, did he introduce himself as a lawyer, as a notary? Elijah was quiet for a moment. He thought of Agnes's account, the way she had described the second man. Quiet, agreeable, mostly looking at his folder. She said he did not say much, Elijah said. She assumed he was Cornelius's colleague. Kwame nodded slowly. He picked up his pen and began to write on a notepad in a small, precise hand. There are two possibilities, he said as he wrote. The first is that the power of attorney is valid, properly witnessed, properly notarized, legally binding. In that case, your brother has the authority to sell, and the challenge becomes one of whether your mother's consent was truly informed, which is a harder argument to make in court, but not an impossible one, particularly given her age and the circumstances of how the document was presented to her. He continued writing. The second possibility is that the document was not properly notarized, that the man with the folder was not a licensed notary, or that the proper procedures were not followed. In that case, the power of attorney is invalid, and any transfer proceeding on its basis would be fraudulent. He set down his pen. He looked at Elijah. Saturday is 4 days away. We do not have time for the slow version of this. What is the fast version? The fast version, Kwame said, begins today. I will file an application this afternoon with the Lands Commission to place a caveat on the Odumasiman plot. A caveat is a formal notice that there is a dispute over the land and it prevents any transfer from being registered until the dispute is resolved. Once the caveat is in place, your brother cannot legally complete the sale regardless of what papers he has. He closed his notepad. I will also write today to the developer. You said the email came from a Lagos company? The email address, yes. I will write to them formally informing them that the land is under dispute and that any transaction proceeding without resolution of that dispute exposes them to significant legal liability. Developers do not like legal liability. It tends to make them cautious. Elijah sat across the desk and felt the specific relief of a problem that is still serious but has begun to have a shape. Shapeless problems are the most terrifying kind. A problem with a shape can be addressed. He thought of his mother sitting in her kitchen with her hands folded on the table and the tiredness in her face that had nothing to do with sleep. He thought of Solomon's handwriting on the piece of paper behind the radio, 15 years patient, waiting for the moment it would be needed. There is a cost, he said. He said it straightforwardly, without embarrassment, because Kwame Acheampong was a man in whose presence embarrassment seemed beside the point. I have been working construction in Senegal for 6 years. I have savings, but they are not large. Kwame waved one hand, a gesture that dismissed the topic without dismissing the person raising it. Solomon Mensah Owusu sat in that chair you are sitting in now, he said, in 2001, when I had a problem with a client who was refusing to pay for 3 months of work. Your father spent 4 hours with me going through every document, every communication, helping me build the case that eventually recovered every pesewa of what I was owed. He refused payment. He said I was his friend and friends did not invoice each other for doing what was right. He picked up his pen again. You will pay me what you can, when you can, and the caveat will be filed this afternoon. That is not generosity. That is a debt being honored 24 years later. Elijah looked at the old lawyer across the desk and thought of his father and felt the particular emotion that has no single name. The gratitude that arrives when you discover that a good man's goodness outlasted him. That the seeds he planted in other people are still bearing fruit long after the planter is gone. He stood and extended his hand. Kwame shook it once, firmly, the handshake of men who have agreed on something serious. Go back to your mother, Kwame said. Keep her calm. Tell her nothing will be signed on Saturday because there will be nothing left to sign. And Elijah, he paused. He looked at him over his desk with the eyes of a man who has seen many families broken by exactly this kind of thing, and who carries that knowledge the way certain people carry the memory of accidents they have witnessed. Always present, always instructive. When this is resolved, he said, and it will be resolved, do not make the mistake of hating your brother. Understand him. A man who steals from his mother is a man who is terrified of something. Find out what he is terrified of. That is where the real conversation will need to happen. He sat back down and reached for the next document on his desk, which was the gesture of a man returning to his work, and Elijah understood that the meeting was complete. He went down the narrow staircase past the crooked sign about justice and out into the tamer afternoon and stood on the street in the heat and called his mother and told her that help was already moving, that the ground was not as lost as it had seemed this morning, that she should rest and cook and pray and leave Saturday to him. Agnes was quiet on the line for a moment. Then she said, "In twy," the phrase she had said at the end of every difficult conversation since he was a child, the one that translated roughly as "God does not sleep, and neither does the truth." He held the phone against his ear after she hung up and stood in the tamer street and let the afternoon sun fall on his face and thought that his father, wherever he was, already knew how this was going to end. Elijah arrived back in Odumasemen as the sun was making its afternoon descent, that particular hour when the light in small Ghanaian towns becomes almost unreasonably beautiful, golden and thick and sideways, catching the dust in the air and turning it into something that looked less like dust and more like the visible evidence of time passing. The avocado tree at the gate cast a long shadow across the compound entrance, and Elijah walked through that shadow and into the compound and found his mother sitting in her veranda chair with her Bible open on her lap and her reading glasses on, and her lips moving slightly in the way they moved when she was reading something she was also praying at the same time, which was how Agnes had always read her Bible, as though the words on the page and the words in her heart were part of the same conversation. She looked up when she heard his footsteps. She read his face the way she had always read his face. "It is handled," he said. She closed the Bible. She took off her reading glasses. She folded her hands on the closed Bible in her lap and looked out at the compound and said nothing for a moment. And in that silence, Elijah understood that she had been sitting here for the past several hours, holding the compound together with her presence the way she had always held things together, quietly, without announcement, with the particular strength of a woman who had learned that strength did not require noise. "Sit with me," she said. He sat in the second chair beside her, the one that had been his father's chair and that had remained his father's chair in the way that certain objects remain in permanent association with the people who are no longer there to use them. They sat together on the veranda in the late afternoon light, and Agnes told him things she had not told him on the phone across 6 years of Sunday calls and monthly money transfers. She told him that Cornelius had begun his visits 8 months ago, shortly after a family gathering at which the topic of the land had come up in the way land topics always came up at family gatherings, sideways, embedded in other conversations, deniable if challenged. She told him that Cornelius had come first alone, then with Vivienne his wife, then with the man with the folder, and that each visit had been warmer than the previous one, full of food brought from the city and small gifts for the grandchildren of neighbors and long conversations on the veranda, during which Cornelius had been charming and attentive and present in a way that had made Agnes, she admitted quietly, feel cared for. "I know what you are thinking," Agnes said. "You are thinking that I should have known." "I am not thinking that," Elijah said. "You are thinking it a little," she said, and almost smiled, because mothers know. "He is my son," she continued. "When your child comes to you with warm food and a warm face and sits with you and asks about your health and remembers the names of your neighbors, you do not spend that visit looking for the knife. You simply receive the warmth. That is what mothers do." Elijah was quiet. "Your father used to say," Agnes continued, looking out at the compound, "that the most dangerous lies are the ones that love you while they lie, because you cannot defend yourself against what feels like care." She paused. A lizard moved across the compound wall, stopped, bobbed its red head twice in that way lizards do, continued. I am not a foolish woman, Elijah. You are the least foolish woman I know, Mama. Then do not look at me the way you have been looking at me since this morning. He looked at her. He looked at her properly, without the layer of worry and calculation that had been sitting over his vision all day, and he saw his mother, not the situation, not the problem, not the woman who had signed documents she should not have signed, but Agnes herself, 74 years old, sitting in her chair on her veranda on her land with her Bible in her lap and her back straight despite everything, and he felt ashamed of the worry that had briefly made him see her as something smaller than she was. "I'm sorry, Mama," he said. She patted his hand once. It was the pat of absolution and also of moving on, because Agnes did not dwell. It was getting toward evening when the gate opened and Patience came in. She was Agnes's niece, 32 years old, a primary school teacher with a direct manner and eyes that missed very little. She greeted Elijah with genuine warmth and the slight additional expressiveness of someone who has been carrying a secret on another person's behalf and is relieved to discover that the secret has been addressed. She sat on the veranda step and Agnes brought her water, and they talked in the easy, layered way of women who are family and have been family through difficulties and understand each other's specific shorthand. After a while, Patience looked at Elijah and said, "He called this morning." "Cornelius." "He called Auntie Agnes. I was here. I came early to sit with her. He said he was confirming Saturday. He said he was bringing the final document and that it would take only a few minutes and then everything would be finished." She paused. "He sounded," she chose her word carefully, "certain. He sounded like a man who is certain that what he is doing will not be interrupted." "He will not be certain for much longer," Elijah said. Patience looked at him. He told them briefly, not everything, not the legal details, but the shape of it, the caveat, the letter to the developer, Kwame Acheampong's name, and his precise, unhurried competence. As he spoke, he watched Agnes's face and saw in it a progressive loosening, the specific physical expression of a burden being redistributed from one set of shoulders to several, which is what burdens become bearable by. That night, Agnes cooked properly for the first time in weeks, she told him. She had not had the appetite, she said, and the kitchen had felt too quiet, which was the kind of thing that happened when worry settled into a house and occupied the rooms that joy normally lived in. She made groundnut soup with fufu, and she made it with the full attention of a woman reclaiming her kitchen, the pounding of the fufu filling the compound with a sound that was rhythm and industry and something like defiance. Patience stayed for dinner. They ate at the table in the main room, the three of them, under the light of the single bulb that Agnes had replaced 2 weeks ago. She had mentioned it to Elijah with a precision that told him the old bulb's failure had felt, in those difficult weeks, like one too many things going wrong at once. They talked about Solomon. This happened naturally, the way conversations about the dead happen naturally when the living are eating the dead person's favorite food in the dead person's house. Agnes told the story of how Solomon had first tasted her groundnut soup at a family gathering in 1971 and had eaten 3 portions and then found her in the kitchen afterward and said, with the directness of a young man who had made a decision, that he intended to eat this soup for the rest of his life, and would she help him arrange that? Patience laughed. Elijah laughed. Agnes told it with the smile of a woman who has told a story many times and finds it no less true for the retelling. After dinner, after Patience had gone and Agnes had gone to bed and the compound was quiet under the night sky, Elijah sat on the veranda in his father's chair and thought about Cornelius. He had been thinking around his brother all day, circling the question of him the way you circle something hot, aware of it, respectful of its capacity to burn, but not yet ready to approach directly. Cornelius was not a stranger. He was not a villain in a story. He was his brother, the brother who had taught him to ride a bicycle on this same compound in 1994, the brother who had given him his first secondary school textbooks, the brother who had called him when Solomon died and had wept on the phone with the unguarded grief of a man who had not yet learned to perform his emotions for an audience. Something had happened to that brother between then and now. Something had gotten into him the way things get into people when they spend too long in rooms where money is the primary language and the people around them have more of it than they do, and the gap between who they are and who they want to be begins to feel like an emergency. Elijah did not excuse it. He did not reduce it to an explanation that made it comfortable. But he held it as a fact that had a history, which was different from holding it as simply a fact, the way Kwame Acheampong had told him to. The night was warm, and the stars over Odumaseman were numerous and indifferent and beautiful. From somewhere down the lane, a radio was playing High Life, the old kind, guitar and brass, and a voice singing about a woman and a river and a promise that had not been kept, and the music moved through the warm night air and reached the veranda and settled there like a guest who had not been invited, but was welcome anyway. Elijah sat in his father's chair and looked at the avocado tree at the gate, its silhouette dark and large against the lighter dark of the sky, and thought about roots. The tree had roots that went down deeper than anyone living had ever seen. The compound wall had been lifted by those roots in 2 places, and everyone had simply adjusted the wall rather than disturbed the tree, which was the kind of practical wisdom that deserved more recognition than it received. Some things, the tree seemed to say in its silent, rooted way, are not moved. Some things go down deep enough that what happens above the ground, however serious, however urgent, however well organized, cannot ultimately dislodge them. He did not know yet whether that was true of this land, but he intended to find out. And if you are sitting somewhere right now watching this story and thinking of your own mother, your own family land, your own thing that must not be lost, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because some stories are not just stories. Some stories are warnings dressed in narrative, and the people who need the warning most are the ones who will only receive it if someone who loves them sends it their way. Saturday arrived the way difficult days always arrive, with complete indifference to the difficulty. The sun came up over Odumasaman at the same angle it always came up. The roosters performed their obligations without awareness of the drama they were inaugurating, and the avocado tree at the gate stood in its permanent, rooted authority, exactly as it had stood every morning for longer than anyone on Mensa Lane could remember. Elijah was awake before the roosters. He had not slept deeply. He had moved in and out of a light, watchful sleep, the kind that soldiers and mothers know where the body rests, but some part of the mind remains at the door. He rose at 5 and washed and dressed, and went to the kitchen and made tea, and stood at the kitchen window in the early grey light and looked at the compound and thought about the day ahead with the focused calm of a man who has done what preparation allows and must now trust what preparation cannot control. Agnes came to the kitchen at 5:30. She was dressed already, not in her house dress but in her good wrapper, the deep blue and gold one she wore to church and to occasions that required her full dignity, which told Elijah everything about how she understood today. She did not explain the choice of clothing. She simply moved to the stove and began to make porridge, and the domestic normalcy of the action, the complete refusal to treat this morning as anything other than a morning that required breakfast, struck Elijah as one of the bravest things he had ever witnessed. They ate together at the kitchen table. They did not talk much. Agnes said that she had prayed for 2 hours in the night and that she felt clear. And Elijah understood that clear was the word she used when she meant that she had placed something in God's hands and had genuinely released her grip on it, which was a thing she had practiced her whole life and which remained, even after all that practice, a difficult thing to do. At 8:15, Kwame Acheampong arrived. Elijah had not expected him to come in person. He had expected a phone call, a confirmation that the documents had been filed, the assurance of a lawyer conducting business from his desk in Tema. But the old Nissan that rattled to a stop outside the compound gate was unmistakably Kwame's, and the man who came through the gate carrying a leather briefcase and wearing a pressed dark suit that said, "I am here in my full professional capacity," was unmistakably the man himself. He greeted Agnes with both hands and a slight bow of the head, the greeting of a man honoring a woman he respects. Agnes received it with the quiet grace of a woman who recognizes genuine respect when it arrives. They sat in the main room, the 3 of them, while the morning continued its business outside. Kwame opened his briefcase and laid the documents on the table with the methodical precision that Elijah had already come to understand was simply how the man operated. no drama, no theater, just the orderly presentation of facts arranged to be useful. The caveat had been filed and confirmed. He showed them the stamped acknowledgement from the Lands Commission. The developer in Lagos had received his letter that same evening and had responded the following morning. Kwame showed them the email, printed and placed in a clear sleeve, stating that they were pausing all negotiations pending resolution of the noted dispute and requesting clarification of the title position before any further engagement. And Chidi Mensah, the man with the folder who had accompanied Cornelius on his visits, had been identified through the Law Society registry. He was not a licensed notary. He was a paralegal who worked for a small documentation firm in Accra that specialized, Kwame said, with the precise dryness of a man choosing his words carefully, in making paperwork look more official than it was. Which meant that the power of attorney Agnes had signed was not properly notarized. Which meant it was not legally valid. Which meant Cornelius had no authority to sign anything on Agnes's behalf. Kwame folded his hands on the table and looked at them both. "Your brother is coming today with documents he believes are legally binding," he said. "They are not. He is coming to complete a transaction he believes has been prepared. It has not been. Whatever he presents to your mother today, she is under no obligation to sign, and any signature she makes today will be challenged immediately and successfully." Agnes sat very straight in her chair and looked at the stamped caveat document on the table, the official language and the official stamp, and the official confirmation that the ground beneath her had been made solid again. And she breathed in slowly and out slowly, and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, in a voice that was entirely steady, "He is still my son." "Yes," Kwame said, "he is. And I will speak to him as his mother," she said. "Not as a complainant, not as a victim, as his mother." Kwame looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has spent 40 years in rooms where families fight over property and has rarely seen the thing he was looking at now. "That," he said quietly, "is your right and your wisdom." Cornelius arrived at 11. He came in his new car, alone this time. No man with a folder, no colleague, just Cornelius in his good shirt and his city shoes, carrying a leather portfolio under his arm and wearing the prepared warmth of a man who has rehearsed his entrance. He came through the gate and stopped when he saw Elijah standing in the compound. The prepared warmth went through several adjustments in the space of 2 seconds. Then he looked at the veranda and saw Kwame Acheampong sitting beside Agnes in his dark suit, and the leather portfolio under his arm became, visibly, a heavier object. "Elijah," he said. His voice was careful. "Brother." Elijah said nothing else. He gestured toward the veranda. They sat, Cornelius across from his mother and Kwame, Elijah to the side, the compound quiet around them, the avocado tree at the gate present in its peripheral rooted way. Agnes spoke first. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She looked at her older son across the veranda table and spoke to him in Twi, slowly and completely, in the voice of a woman who has earned the right to every word she is using. She told him that she knew. She told him that she understood the shape of what he had been building across 8 months of warm visits and small gifts and patient, carefully worded conversations. She told him that she did not believe he had begun with the intention to harm her, but that somewhere between the beginning and now, something had happened to his intention, and the something that had happened was that he had decided that what he wanted was more important than what she deserved. Cornelius sat across from his mother and listened. His portfolio was on his knees. His hands were on his portfolio. His jaw was set in a way that Elijah recognized from childhood, the specific set of Cornelius's jaw when he was fighting the urge to defend himself, which was an urge that usually won. This time, it did not win. This time he sat, and he listened to his mother's voice, and something in his face changed. Slowly, the way faces change when the performance that has been holding them in a particular arrangement loses its reason to continue. Kwame presented the documents. He presented them without commentary beyond what was factually necessary. The caveat, the invalid power of attorney, the developer's withdrawal. He placed each document on the table and let it speak in its own official language and said only, at the end, The land is protected. Any further attempt to proceed with this transaction will be challenged in court and will be challenged successfully. I would advise that this matter be considered closed." Cornelius looked at the documents. He looked at them for a long time. Then he looked at his mother. And Elijah watched his brother's face and saw the moment, the precise, identifiable moment, when the architecture of the plan he had been constructing for 8 months came down. It did not come down in anger. It came down in something quieter and more complete than anger. It came down in the particular collapse of a man who has been found out not by an enemy, but by his mother, which is the finding out that cannot be rationalized or redirected or survived with one's self-story intact. "Mama," he began. "I am not finished," Agnes said, and he was quiet. She told him that she was not going to the police. She told him that she was not going to tell the extended family. She told him that what had happened on this veranda today would remain on this veranda. Not because what he had done was acceptable, it was not, and she would not pretend otherwise, but because she was his mother, and she had carried him before he could carry himself, and she was not prepared to destroy him in order to correct him. She told him that what she required from him, the only thing she required, was that he sit with what he had attempted and understand it fully and without excuse, and that he find in himself, wherever it was still living, the son she had raised and return to being that person. She told him that the land would pass to both her sons equally when she died, as Solomon had intended, and that this was not a negotiation and was not a conversation and was not something that any document or any lawyer or any developer from Lagos could alter. And then she said, with the finality of a woman closing a chapter that she is choosing not to burn, "Now you will stay for food." Cornelius looked at his mother for a long time. His portfolio was still on his knees. Then he set it on the table carefully, and it sat there between them like a thing that had been put down and would not be picked up again. His eyes were wet. He did not wipe them immediately, which was the most honest thing Elijah had seen his brother do in years. "I am sorry, Mama," he said. His voice was stripped of everything except the thing underneath. Agnes looked at her son. She looked at him the way mothers look at children who have done wrong and are genuinely sorry and are still irreducibly their children. "I know," she said. She rose from her chair and went inside to the kitchen, and the sound of the clay pot and the wooden spoon began, and the smell of ground nut soup moved through the house and out onto the veranda, where two brothers sat across from each other in the late morning light of Odumaseman, and the avocado tree stood at the gate in its ancient, indifferent faithfulness, and Mr. Kwame Akeampong quietly placed his documents back in his briefcase and clicked it shut and looked out at the compound with the expression of a man who has done what justice required and is at peace with the day. Elijah looked at his brother. Cornelius looked back. Between them was everything that had happened and everything that had not been said, and the long, complicated road of two men who shared a mother and a history and would have to find their way back to each other across what this week had cost them. It would not be quick, it would not be simple, but the land was still there. The tree was still there. And Agnes was in her kitchen making soup for both her sons, which was perhaps the most powerful statement available to a mother, that she would feed you through your failures, that the table would be set regardless, that love in its truest form was not a reward for good behavior, but a condition that preceded behavior and survived it and would, God willing, outlast it. Are you watching this story from Accra, Lagos, London, Toronto, or somewhere else in this world? Drop your location in the comments right now and tell us, did this story touch something in you? Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to this channel so that every story we tell finds its way to you. Because as the elders say, the tree that survives the storm is not the one with the most branches, it is the one with the deepest roots. And in Odumaseman, on a plot of land that had belonged to one woman's mother and would belong to her sons and their children after them, the roots went down very deep indeed.